My son once told me, don't expect a dime from Dad's 92 million. But at the reading of the will, the color drained from his face the second he heard my name. She's still alive? Thought she'd be gone by now. Maybe we should check her pulse before we keep reading. If you're listening to this, please like the video, subscribe, and drop a comment about where you're tuning in from. That's the first thing I heard as I came downstairs, still dressed in black, still carrying the faint scent of roses from my husband's funeral. They hadn't even finished patting down the last shovel of dirt before everyone rushed back to the estate. Not to grieve, not to remember him, but for the feast and the fortune. The hallway was buzzing, voices overlapping, laughter spilling out, shoes clicking across the marble floors of what used to be my sanctuary. I stood at the foot of the stairs, holding the banister my husband once polished by hand, watching them circle the house like vultures around a carcass. This one's mine, my grandson said, slapping a neon green sticky note on the grandfather clock, then the leather armchair, and finally on the cabinet with our wedding china. He moved like a man in a showroom, claiming prizes he never earned. His sister was there too, holding her phone with some home design app open, blueprints and measurements flashing across the screen. We'll remodel this once she's out, she said to no one in particular. Maybe a spa room, definitely better lighting. I kept standing there. No one offered me a chair. No one even looked at me. Then my daughter-in-law appeared, smiling, a tray of champagne flutes in her hands. We're celebrating Dad's legacy, she chirped. He built an empire, and now we get to carry it forward. Someone nearby muttered, and clean out the ghosts. That got a round of laughter. My seat at the dining table was gone, replaced with a wobbly folding chair dragged in from the garage. No cushion, no place for comfort. They told me, you'll be more comfortable in the mudroom, away from all the noise. So I sat there, staring at a mop bucket and a broken broom, a paper plate of dry chicken and overcooked potatoes in front of me. No one noticed. No one cared. From the next room, I could hear them talking. This house smells like mothballs and death, someone said. Let's rip out the wallpaper, gut the kitchen. My grandson peeled another bright sticker and slapped it onto the sideboard beside me. This one's mine, he said again, grinning like he'd just won a prize at the fair. His sister walked in, still holding her phone. Once she's gone, we'll remodel this, she said casually. Maybe a wine nook? Or a spa corner? They didn't whisper. They didn't even glance my way. I sat very still, holding my teacup with both hands so it wouldn't shake. Then I heard another voice. Dad always said she'd die before him. Guess that was his only mistake. Someone laughed. She made soup. He built an empire. The laughter grew louder. Let her rot with the memories, a cousin sneered. She doesn't even know what year it is. My granddaughter joked, can we still cash her pension checks if we forward her mail? Her brother added, she's half dead already. Just give her the garden shed and call it done. I took a bite of cold chicken. It tasted like chalk. But I swallowed it anyway. I didn't speak. I didn't argue. I just reached into my sweater pocket and felt the crisp edge of the document I'd kept hidden all these years. A bank memorandum, signed and notarized 15 years ago. My name was there, written in blue ink, not black, the kind of detail that matters in court. They never knew. They never asked. Back when the company was on the edge of bankruptcy, when everything was about to fall apart, it wasn't the lawyers or accountants who saved it. It was me. I sold every piece of heirloom jewelry I ever owned. My mother's emerald necklace, my wedding bangles, even the brooch I wore the night of our engagement party. I didn't tell a soul. I just wired the money and whispered to my husband, use it, but please, never let them know it came from me. He didn't. Not until now. From the next room, I could hear my son's voice. We'll take the lake house, he said. The boat's already under my name anyway. Someone else chimed in, the Lexus is mine. Dad promised it to me last Christmas. Then the youngest laughed, I want the Hermes scarves. Even if they're hers, she's not using them. More laughter. They were dividing up my skin while I was still breathing inside it. One of them wandered into the mudroom, surprised to see me sitting there. There's bottled water in the garage fridge, he said casually. Maybe grab one, you look pale. Then he left, not waiting for a reply. I stayed there for another hour while they picked apart the art, the land, the memories. Someone even dragged suitcases upstairs, claiming the master bedroom for the weekend. One of the girls asked if they could paint it pink. Eventually, the champagne ran out and the music stopped, but the smell of greed still hung in the air, thicker than the dust on the drapes. I stood up slowly. My knees ached. I steadied myself on the edge of the sink and looked out the small window above it. The roses my husband planted along the driveway were starting to wilt. No one had watered them in days. I wondered if anyone even noticed. When I stepped back into the house, no one asked where I had been. My footsteps were soft, like the ghost they already believed I was. But I wasn't done. Not yet. I could feel the paper in my pocket, warm now from the heat of my hand. Let them laugh. Let them decorate. Let them drink. The reading of the will was coming, and I had a pulse, a loud, steady, undeniable one. They look at me like I'm a burden, a shadow haunting their perfect little story of success. But there's a chapter they erased, the one where I saved everything, and no one ever knew. 15 years ago, the company was falling apart. I still remember the night Robert came home late, his tie loosened, his hands shaking, silence heavier than any words. He didn't have to tell me. The bank had called. The numbers didn't lie. We were on the edge of losing everything. The clients, the contracts, even the house. We just need one deal, he said, staring into the fireplace like he could burn the shame right out of himself. Just one. If we can close with those investors in New York, we'll make it. But there was a problem. To lock in that deal, he needed collateral, money he didn't have, and pride he refused to swallow. So I made a choice. That night, while he slept, I took out the velvet box hidden in the back of my dresser drawer. Inside were the last pieces of my dowry, the diamond earrings from our wedding night, the emerald ring passed down from my mother, the heavy gold bangles I wore when I first came to this house as a bride. Every piece carried a memory, every sparkle a story. And I sold them all, quietly, without asking, without telling. The next morning, I wired the funds directly to the company's escrow account and told him only one thing: use it. Don't let them see you fall. He never asked where the money came from. He didn't want to know. That was Robert, strong on the outside, silent on the inside. 2 days later, the deal closed. The investors signed. The company lived. They called him a visionary. They called him a self-made miracle. And I stayed in the shadows, smiling quietly, knowing the truth. They never called me. But honestly, that wasn't even the part that hurt the most. A month later, I saw the new branding materials, Robert's face, bold on the front page, a slogan underneath that read, "Legacy built alone." I smiled when I saw it, bit my lip, said nothing. But I remember. I remember everything. I remember the night I wrote the IPO pitch by hand. Robert was getting ready for another investor meeting and had no idea where to begin. The market was shifting, the whole industry was changing, and he was still pitching like it was 1995. So after everyone went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea and started to write. I outlined a multi-phase expansion plan built on emerging trends, projected shareholder value, and a scalable growth model tied to supply chain reform. I'd done it before, in another life, before marriage, before babies, before the business card that read, "Homemaker." That night, I signed the document with a name no one would recognize. A pen name, something harmless, something clean. The next morning, I sealed it in an envelope, stamped it, and mailed it to the office. No return address. Just his name and the company's. 2 days later at dinner, Robert mentioned a strange proposal someone had sent anonymously. "It's brilliant," he said, laughing. "Even the handwriting looks familiar, like yours." I shrugged and kept stirring the soup. That proposal became the foundation of their IPO launch 6 months later. It brought in over $40 million in new investments. They hung a plaque in the lobby, calling it inspired by ingenuity. His ingenuity. But I didn't mind. Not then. I told myself the family only needed one hero, and it was better to let him be it. It's funny how women are taught to disappear gracefully, to take pride in being the spine while someone else gets the face. We're told that quiet loyalty is noble, that sacrifice is strength. But silence too long becomes an eraser. And now they walk through my house taping their names onto furniture, speaking of legacy like I was never part of it. Now they laugh at my memory, question my mind, mock my usefulness. They don't know what I gave, what I built, what I hid. Upstairs, in my closet under the linens no one ever touches, there's a folder. Inside is the original draft of that proposal, ink slightly smudged from a night of restless hands. My pen name in the corner. Folded next to it is a letter from the U.S. Patent Office, the one that ties the pitch strategy to a registered idea. Registered not under the company, but under me. I've never cashed the royalty checks. They come quarterly, have for years. I never needed the money. I needed the quiet. I needed the dignity of knowing what I'd done, even if no one else did. But now they've drawn a line in the sand. They fed me shame. They stripped me of memory. They called me dead while I still breathed. So I've opened the folder again. I've spoken to the lawyer. I've hired a handwriting analyst. I've documented everything. Not for revenge. Not even for justice. But for truth. Because when they sit in that room and the will is read, when they hear my name tied not just to the trust but to the legacy they thought was theirs alone, there will be silence. For once, I will be loud. And not one of them will be able to erase me again. They didn't even look me in the eyes when they did it. It was a Tuesday, 5 days after the funeral. The house still smelled faintly of lilies and pine from the casket spray. Someone had left the condolence cards on the piano, unopened, as if even grief was too inconvenient to process. But their energy had shifted. The mourning was over. Now came the sorting, the claiming, the clearing. And the clearing began with me. We've decided it's best, Clarissa said, not even bothering to lower her voice. She can move to the small room downstairs. I blinked. The laundry room. Technically, it's a utility space, she corrected with a tight smile, but there's room for a cot. My bedroom, our bedroom, was already gone. Upstairs I could hear the laughter, the creak of closet doors, the thud of drawers being pulled open. Someone rolled a suitcase down the hallway. My perfume bottles, my silk scarves, my books, they were being tossed into cardboard boxes. Not carefully. Not lovingly. Just removed. I shuffled slowly toward the stairs and saw a label stuck to one of the boxes. Donation. Another read, outdated. A third, in bold marker, old lady junk. They didn't even have the decency to hide the labels. Clarissa's husband, my grandson Tyler, held a clipboard, gesturing toward the furniture like a foreman at a moving company. That end table's perfect for the cabin, he said to her. Put a sticker on it. A neon pink post-it appeared on the oak surface like a bruise. This one's mine, someone announced. Piece by piece, my memories were claimed. The wedding china. The rocking chair where I nursed Ryan through the croup. Even the old record player, the one Robert and I danced to during blackouts, now bore a cheerful sticker. Clarissa turned to me with that sharp, polished smile she wore like armor. She doesn't need a room, she told the group. Just a bed until she's gone. A few awkward chuckles followed. No one spoke up. One of the younger boys, Ethan I think, though I can hardly keep track anymore, whispered something as he passed by the kitchen door. If we keep her address, we can still cash her pension checks. They laughed at that one. I didn't. I simply walked, knees stiff, to what used to be the laundry room. It smelled of bleach and mildew. A single bare bulb flickered overhead. A plastic mop bucket stood in one corner. Beside a rusted utility sink. Against the wall sat a cot. No sheets, just an old moving blanket. That was to be my room now. My suitcase had already been placed beside it. On top sat a dented thermos and a framed photo, its glass cracked in the corner. I picked it up. It was from our 30th anniversary, Robert's arm around me, my hand on his chest, the rose arbor behind us, the house standing tall and proud. Back then it had felt like hours. But that same photo had been pulled off the hallway wall and stashed behind the refrigerator. I'd found it face down, wedged between a broom and a box of expired granola bars when I went to get some water. They didn't even want to look at it. Did they think I wouldn't notice? Or did they think I'd forget? They forget that I remember everything. I remember the night Robert carved our initials into the porch rail. I remember the scent of cinnamon and vanilla on Christmas mornings. I remember holding Ryan as he wept over his college rejection, whispering, "You're still enough." I remember baking birthday cakes from scratch, driving to midnight rehearsals, hand-sewing curtains to make this house a home. But now, I'm just a placeholder. A logistical burden. something to step over on the way to an inheritance. Later that evening, Clarissa stopped by my cot with a folded towel and a plastic bottle of unscented shampoo. "These are for you," she said, setting them down like charity. "We'll have dinner around 7. You can eat after we're done." I nodded. That's all I could do. That night, while they laughed over steaks and wine in the dining room, I sat on the cot in my so-called room, peeling open a tin of soup I'd hidden from the pantry. I had to use the end of a key. They hadn't even left me a can opener. "They say I built soup." That's what I heard earlier when they thought I wasn't listening. "Dad built an empire," one of them said. "She built soup." As if nourishment wasn't a foundation. As if warmth and care and sacrifice meant nothing because it didn't show up on a stock portfolio. "I built soup, yes. But I also built them." And now, they're tearing me down with giggles, with tape, with tiny neon stickers. The cruelty isn't loud, it's quiet, surgical, polite. But it cuts all the same. Later that night, when the house finally went still, I crept back to the kitchen and pulled the anniversary photo from behind the fridge. I wiped the dust off the glass and pressed it against my chest. This was once my home. I was once the heart of it. They may think they've erased me, but all they've done is remind me what I once gave, and what I can still take back. Tomorrow, the lawyer calls. And this time, I'll answer, with the voice they forgot I had. It started with a folder, old, worn, leather-bound. I kept it beneath the loose floorboard in the laundry room, now my bedroom, behind a crate of mop heads no one ever touched. Inside were the things they never thought to ask about, because they never asked about me. The morning after they measured my room for their spa remodel, I took the folder and walked 2 blocks through the cold to the payphone outside the Lakewood Pharmacy. They'd cut off my cell service by mistake, but I hadn't forgotten the number. When Mr. Alden answered, I simply said, "It's time." He didn't ask what I meant. He just said, "Come in tomorrow." Mr. Alden had been Robert's lawyer for decades. What they never knew is that he'd also been mine, long before the marriage became a performance, long before I faded into wallpaper and casseroles. The next day, in his office, I laid out the documents one by one. First, the joint trust certificate, my name right there beside Robert's. Not as a witness. Not as a dependent. As co-founder. Co-executor. Then, the investment agreement from First Savings Bank of California, dated 15 years ago. The deposit was there in black and white. My dowry, my mother's emerald necklace, the gold bangles from my wedding chest. I'd sold them all quietly when Robert's company was on the brink of collapse. That money bought him the merger that saved Montgomery Industries. I never asked for credit. I only asked for him to survive it. Last, I slid forward a bundle of handwritten pages, yellowed with time, corners curled, ink faded in places. Each one bore my handwriting. "It's the original proposal," I told him softly. "The model for the IPO." Mr. Alden narrowed his eyes. "You wrote this?" I shook my head. "I sent it. Under a pseudonym." He submitted it under his name. I remember that night vividly, Robert pacing the den, a glass of scotch untouched on the mantel, his board having rejected every draft he'd shown them. I'd waited until he was asleep, then pulled out a pad of paper and wrote until dawn. By morning, my fingers were stained with ink. I never told him it was mine. I mailed it to our P.O. box with no return address. He presented it at the next board meeting as his own. They approved it unanimously. It made him $38 million. And I never said a word. Mr. Alden leaned closer. "May I?" he asked. He opened a file cabinet and pulled out a small envelope. Inside was another letter, typed, but signed L. Brightwood, the same pseudonym I'd used on the handwritten draft. I watched as he compared the signatures. "Do you still write like this?" Mr. Alden asked. I nodded. That same afternoon, he called in a specialist, a handwriting analyst from Stanford. They spent nearly 2 hours together, studying every loop, curve, pressure point, and pause. A few days later, the report came in. The letters were a perfect match. 100%. And not only that, the original documents included intellectual property clauses. Copyright and authorship belonged to me. According to federal patent law, the framework for the IPO qualified as an invention. And because it had never been formally transferred, and I could prove authorship, the royalty rights defaulted back to me. Millions, possibly more, depending on the duration of profit. All mine. Mr. Alden looked across the polished mahogany desk and asked quietly, "You understand what this means?" I nodded. "I don't want the money," I said. "Not all of it." He tilted his head. "Then what do you want?" I folded the letter back into the folder, stood, and said, "I want my voice back." And for the first time in months, maybe years, I smiled, a small, knowing smile that began somewhere deep in my chest and worked its way to my lips. They buried me while I was still thinking. They assumed silence meant uselessness, that love meant absence, that motherhood meant surrender. They thought I'd faded, like wallpaper in a sunlit room. But I hadn't disappeared. I was watching, remembering. I hadn't forgotten who I was. I was the girl who read contracts by candlelight while her husband slept. The woman who taught herself investment law with a borrowed library card. The mother who made soup, yes, but also made decisions. Smart ones. Now, as they tripped over each other, carving up a house I helped build, they had no idea that the land beneath their feet carried my name. The paper trail was already with the court. By the time they sat down for the will reading, everything would be ready. But first, I let them have their party. Their games, their laughter, their little performances of grief. I let them dance around the ashes, thinking I had already blown away with the wind. Because they had forgotten me. And that was their last mistake. They made me sit at the end of the table. On a folding chair, of course. Heaven forbid my old lady aura ruin the aesthetic of their designer suits and polished handbags. The law office was sleek, all glass walls and leather trim, cold in every possible way. Outside, rain drummed steadily against the windows. Inside, it might as well have been snowing. My son, Joseph Montgomery, sat near the front, legs crossed confidently, wedding ring shining under the recessed lights. His wife leaned over and whispered something in his ear. He chuckled just loud enough for the room to hear. "She'll be dead by next Christmas," he muttered, sipping espresso from a tiny porcelain cup. "Don't expect a dime for her." My granddaughter was texting under the table. My grandson was idly practicing his signature on a legal pad. Not one of them looked at me. Then the door opened. Mr. Alden walked in, briefcase in hand, his expression calm and deliberate, the kind of man whose very presence usually signaled the end of a question. "Thank you all for being here," he began. "Today, we're here to execute the final wishes of Mr. Robert Montgomery, as stated in his legally binding, revised will." No one noticed the slight emphasis on revised. A few folders were passed down the table. Papers shuffled. Chairs squeaked. Then Mr. Alden reached into his case and took out a small silver voice recorder. He pressed play. Robert's voice filled the room, slower than I remembered, more tired, but clear. "Calm. Measured. If my son ever speaks ill of his mother," he said, "deduct $1 million per word." Silence. The air in the room thinned, as if someone had flipped on a vacuum. Then the voice continued, "You know how many he owes." There was a moment of stunned silence. Then the sharp clack of a pen hitting the table. Joseph leaned forward, his face pale. "What the hell does that mean?" he demanded. "That's not real. That's not." Mr. Alden lifted one hand, calm and steady, and slid a printed transcript across the table. "Exhibit A," he said. "Verified PIU transcript, home security system, kitchen, 3 days after the funeral." He began to read. 1. She's still breathing. 2. Thought she'd be gone by now. 3. Check her pulse at the will reading. 4. She built soup. He built an empire. He kept going. 587,184 total recorded statements deemed ill of his mother. He paused. That equals $88 million in deductions. You could hear someone inhale too sharply, then exhale through their teeth. Mr. Alden continued, unflinching. Some of those statements were colorful. The remaining $3,996,200 have been subtracted as a discretionary penalty, per Clause 14C in Mr. Montgomery's addendum. He turned the final page. Remaining inheritance for Mr. Joseph Montgomery, $3,800. Joseph shot up from his chair. "This is insane. You can't do this. That woman, she's been a drain for years." "Dad wouldn't." "He would," I said quietly. It was the first time I'd spoken all morning. The sound of my voice cut through the air sharper than any gavel. Everyone turned. I didn't have to raise it. Mr. Alden stayed perfectly calm. Now, he said, as for the primary beneficiary of the trust, the copyrights and remaining estate assets, Robert Montgomery has left them all to his wife, Eleanor Montgomery. He handed me the folder. It was heavier than I expected. Inside were the property deeds, the portfolio transfers, the intellectual property rights tied to the IPO model, and a smaller envelope containing a deed to an apartment in Paris. There was also a letter. Handwritten. My husband's. Forgive me for the years I let your light stay hidden. I never forgot. I only hoped that someday they would see what I did. If they can't, then let this speak louder than I ever could. You built this with me. Now let the world know your name. Joseph stood frozen, color draining from his face. His wife reached for her phone, probably to call a lawyer. Or a therapist. Maybe a priest. I looked around the table at the people who'd practiced their victory speeches on the drive over, and I said nothing. Because justice doesn't need noise. It just needs truth. I rose slowly, gathering my coat, the same old beige one they'd called depressing last Christmas. I walked past Joseph, whose hand was clenched tight around the polished edge of the table. At the door, I paused by the coat rack and turned to Mr. Alden. Will that be all? He nodded once. Enjoy Paris. And I did, I said softly. But not before turning back to the family I had fed, clothed, shielded, and finally, outlived. You buried me while I was still thinking, I told them, voice steady. Too bad I had one more idea left. The silence that followed wasn't just awkward, it was bone deep. But I wasn't finished. Mr. Alden knew that. He opened his briefcase again and drew out a second envelope. This, he said, unfolding it with gloved care, pertains to an intellectual property matter not previously disclosed to the family. He laid out a series of documents across the glossy table. 15 years ago, shortly before Montgomery Industries avoided bankruptcy through a game-changing IPO strategy, an anonymous proposal was submitted by mail. The model in that proposal became the blueprint for the company's public offering. He turned to page 2. This patent, he said, was formally filed under the pseudonym E.B. Sinclair, originally assumed to be a consultant or outside strategist. Joseph crossed his arms, jaw tight. What does this have to do with anything? It was Dad's company. His plan. Mr. Alden flipped to the third page, unhurried, unbothered, deliberate. Actually, he said, it has everything to do with her. And then he looked straight at me. It has everything to do with this, Mr. Montgomery, Mr. Alden said evenly, because we've just completed a full forensic analysis of the original drafts of that proposal, ink composition, handwriting comparison, and the timing of postal submission. He slid a certificate across the table. The pseudonym was hers, he added, pointing at me. Your mother, Eleanor Montgomery. Even the air in the room seemed to hesitate. This, he continued, holding up a framed certificate, is the formal recognition of Eleanor Montgomery as the sole intellectual contributor to patent 1229457B, also known as the Montgomery stabilization model. His voice stayed calm, but each word landed like a gavel. That patent now yields residuals through multiple licensing streams, amounting to $9.4 million annually. Joseph's wife clutched her scarf. Catherine, my granddaughter, dropped her phone onto the polished floor. But Joseph just stammered. She made soup. She mended socks. Mr. Alden allowed himself the faintest smile. Yes, he said. And she saved your father's legacy. He pulled a folded letter from a separate envelope, slightly aged but still crisp. Before his passing, Robert had sealed it and notarized it. Mr. Alden cleared his throat and began to read aloud. She found the cure before the world knew it was broken. She kept quiet because she loved me. I asked her to let me take the credit because the board would not follow a woman. But I knew. I always knew. This company is her mind on paper. A sharp breath came from the back of the room, the sound of someone realizing that everything they thought they knew had just cracked like old glass. Joseph muttered something under his breath. What was that? I asked, meeting his eyes. For the first time, he looked at me. I didn't know, he said, voice small. I didn't answer because I'd spent years erasing my name so Robert could be seen as whole. I'd kept my name off the plaque. I'd burned the drafts. I'd even mailed the final model from a different zip code. But I had never forgotten. Mr. Alden passed around one last page, a ledger of every quarterly payout the patent had earned since inception. All of it signed to a holding trust, untouched, waiting. It's yours now, he said, handing me a black folder with gold trim. Catherine's voice rose, strangely small. So, we were living off her mind all along. No one replied. They were all too busy staring at their own reflections in the glass walls, wondering how they'd missed the most important mind in the house because it was wrapped in an apron. I stood. They didn't stop me. Not this time. I drew the map, I said quietly, buttoning my coat. And you all thought it appeared by accident. No one moved as I left. The same woman they'd once dismissed as furniture, as fading wallpaper, had just reminded them that empires rise on the backs of women too smart to be seen and too strong to be erased. They were given 48 hours. That's what the letter said, signed by the executor, stamped by the court. A legal deadline for the ungrateful to vanish from the house they'd once trampled. By morning, the packing began. Boxes thudded down the hallway. Laughter, for once, was gone. Catherine didn't say a word. Her eyes were red, but her hands moved quickly, sweeping jewelry into velvet cases that no longer belonged to her. Joseph tried. Please, Mom. That's all he could manage before his voice broke. I looked at him, this man who once sat on my lap to read the cereal box, who used to hold my hand during storms, now reduced to a trembling shadow, asking for a second chance. I didn't cry. I'd done enough of that. I simply said, "You spoke first." The will had just listened. Joseph slumped back in his chair as if the truth had struck him harder than any slap. From the kitchen came his wife's voice, sharp and shrill. "You're heartless." "She's heartless." I stepped into the doorway. "No," I said quietly. "I gave you a house. You gave me hell." She opened her mouth again, but I was done lending her my ears. I walked through the home slowly, gently, as if reintroducing myself to something sacred. The hallway still smelled faintly of old lemons and sunlight, but it wasn't cluttered with arrogance anymore. I passed the guest room, once destined to be a spa, now empty. A tiny sticker caught my eye on the vanity mirror. "This one's mine." I peeled it off, folded it once, and dropped it into the trash. Room by room, I gathered them all. The blue one on the antique dresser. The yellow one on the armchair with Robert's initials carved beneath the cushion. The green one on the silver frame of our wedding photo. "This one's mine," they had said. Not anymore. Not ever, really. They had just mistaken kindness for consent. In the dining room, where laughter once lived, I stopped by the grand piano. Someone had left a sticker there too. I closed the lid gently. "That one was always his," I whispered. "And he gave it to no one." The house felt still then, not empty, just clean. As though it had been holding its breath for too long and could finally exhale. Outside, I stepped onto the back porch. The roses were gone, uprooted last summer to make space for their wine-tasting corner. But the old pomegranate tree still stood crooked beside the window, stubborn and split from too many summers. And near its base, I saw it, the tiny rose bush I'd planted when Joseph turned 5. Just one brittle stem remained. Thorns bare. Leaves curled. Forgotten. I knelt down, knees pressing against the cool tile. The soil was dry, bone dry. Behind the shed, I found the watering can, half rusted, but still useful. I poured slowly, listening to the earth drink. As the water sank in, I whispered, "We bloom again." Not because they believed we would, but because I never stopped tending the roots. The wind picked up then, brushing across the porch, carrying with it a strange kind of silence, the kind that comes only after a house has been reclaimed. This house wasn't haunted anymore. It was mine. I sold the estate the following spring. Not out of anger. Not for revenge. Just because it no longer felt like home. Some places collect too much noise, and no amount of dusting can quiet what's been said inside their walls. When the sale was finalized, I moved into a small penthouse near the sea in Santa Barbara, the kind of place with wide windows, white curtains, and the hush of waves always just a breath away. No squeaky stairs. No whispers behind doors. No stickers claiming what never belonged to them. Just peace, and room to think out loud this time. The royalties from the patent still arrived, steady and quiet. But I didn't need it all. So I started something new. A fund. A small foundation with a long name, Women Who Were Erased. It wasn't flashy. No gala. No ribbon-cutting ceremony. Just a bank account, a mission, and enough to offer scholarships, grants, and, most importantly, recognition to women who had built silently and been forgotten loudly. Because I knew what that felt like. I knew what it meant to whisper brilliance into someone else's spotlight. And I knew how good it felt to take that light back. Outside my front door, I hung a small wooden sign. It read, "We bloom again." It was hand-carved from the old oak tree my husband and I once planted together. When the storm split it years ago, I saved a piece, just enough to make a sign. It read, "This house was funded by a burden. Enjoy the silence." The mailman chuckled every time he saw it. Inside, I didn't keep much. Just the essentials, and a few memories I couldn't bear to part with. One of them was a faded drawing, taped to the fridge. Crayon on construction paper. My youngest grandson made it years before they taught him to roll his eyes at me, a stick figure version of me in big glasses, standing next to a giant light bulb. In bright purple letters, it said, "To Grandma, you think better than Google." I'd almost thrown it away once, back when they said I was losing my mind, that my memory was slipping, that I should sit still, smile, and stay quiet. But I didn't forget that drawing. And I never forgot how to think. They buried me in assumptions, old, tired, fading, irrelevant. But I wasn't any of those things. I was patient. I was watching. I was remembering what they wanted erased. And most importantly, I was still thinking. Because I never stopped. They thought I was fading. But I was just waiting for the right moment. To think out loud. So if you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or pushed aside, remember this. Your story isn't over until you decide it is. She was more than a mother. More than a wife. More than a woman standing quietly in the background. She was the mind that built the map. And when they tried to erase her, she rewrote the ending. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, and if you've been through something like this, share your story in the comments.